Going back to this is kind of a question from our Atlas study group on the first part of your answer. So there's some, if we don't really know, there was some suggestion that maybe God interacted with man in some ways to kind of move forward the species, so to speak.
Like, was God involved in evolution?
Yeah, and also in populating the planet. We don't know who Cain's blood was. This isn't my question. This is the group's question.
Oh, it's a good question. It's a common question.
Question.
I mean, I don't know. The question is, was God involved in evolution? Where do all these people come from? If it's not just Adam and Eve, and they all evolved, how quick, how fast? Science tells us that, modern man sort of showed up about 100,000 years ago, probably in East Africa or North Africa, and that when humanity evolved into kind of dumber versions of what we are now, it happened on a pretty big scale. There was a bunch of people. If that's true, and I don't know if it is, because I'm not a scientist, but if that's true, I find the biblical account pretty easy to reconcile with that. I go, okay, great. God created the heavens and the earth with a big bang, and then a bunch of stuff happened that God was involved in, that God authored, that he oversaw. That's an easy leap for me to make, as opposed as in terms of when sort of humanity kind of woke up and we're no longer Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal or whatever. That's easy for me to see that as God being involved in that process, as God giving us self-awareness, consciousness, a spiritual awareness, relationship with him. I understand that largely in terms of an invitation. And if Adam and Eve were literal people, it's easy for me to see that God would inspire somebody, maybe like this priest character, to sort of think it through their terms and then talk about what it was like for them to be intermingled with all the other people in the world. But again, that's getting really, really specific, and that goes way beyond the scope of either the book of Genesis or my own understanding of history or science. I just go, it doesn't seem like a problem for me to reconcile God's involvement with Adam and Eve and evolution and other people, especially when we consider how late Genesis 1 was written. You're talking about a guy in 550, 600 BC, probably sitting in a prison cell, writing something under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that's largely a response to this Babylonian poem that we'll talk about next week. So when you kind of look at it through those glasses, these other things become totally speculative, I don't know. And my real big thing is I don't think anybody else knows either. And when people start claiming to know, that makes me really uncomfortable. In a sense, I wish I could claim to know, because that would make everybody feel better, Then everybody could go, oh, Dave says this, but this guy says this, and there's lots of responses. But I think God invites us into greater mystery than that. He's saying that's not the point. The point is who I am, him, right? Who you are, how we're together, and what our job is in the world. And those things, I think, we can really land strongly on those things.
And if you had the opportunity to ask one question of God about Genesis 1 and 2, do you have a question, or is there a question that comes to mind that you would want to ask him?
Yeah.
I asked that because of all the studying that you've done in preparation for all this. Has there been questions that have come to mind that?
Yeah, honestly, if I stood before God and he said, you get one question, and it's about these 2 chapters, I think my honest question would be, am I doing okay? Am I, as I'm imitating you, as I'm this statue, this idol, this shadow, am I doing okay? Is this what you want? Does my life look like the way my life's supposed to look when you set it up like this? And that's my big heartbeat, as I go, maybe in 100 years, they find a bunch of new evidence that makes everything we're saying today totally out to lunch. But when I stand before Jesus, I just want to go, we're good, right? Right? So, it's,
What does it not look like?
it's literary.
Literary?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, when you read the Proverbs, you know what you're reading. When you read the Psalms, you know what you're reading. You're reading these expressions of worship, right? When you just look at Genesis 1 on the page, it looks like all of those because of the way it's been edited, right? So that's a clue that kind of anybody can get, that you're looking at something distinct from just a story or whatever. And I don't think there's anything wrong with reading it and reading it at face value. I mean, you could read it and go, okay, it looks like God created the earth in 6 days. Maybe he did. My problem is how many people get really angry and defensive about him having created it in 6 days, 6,000 years ago or whatever. Because I don't think that's what the text is about. I think at first glance, I get how people come away with that impression. But because it's such a controversial piece of the Bible, and because that issue of the age of the earth and evolution is so hot in culture, then I think we ought to do diligence with the text and really, get deep into it and study it and read the people who are Bible experts, not the people who are science experts or the people who are culture experts. Read the Bible experts on what they say that text is about. And that's a very different approach than just saying, oh, it's a metaphor or a poem, or we don't have to take it literally, So, yeah. So, and then in terms of how you know when to turn it off and when to stop reading things as a metaphor, well, if in doubt, read everything literally until it gets hugely called into question. I mean, for the first 25 years of my life, I read Genesis 1 literally and think I was doing the best job I was able to do of serving Jesus and giving everything I had to Jesus. As my understanding deepens about the text, my expression of serving Jesus deepens and changes and broadens and has more traction to it. But I don't think everything I used to believe is stupid. I just think that the more I want to learn, there's more there to round out my comprehension. Does that make sense? That's a long answer, but yeah.
But let me ask you a question. What would you say to someone like Ken Ham, who founded Answers in Genesis and has the Creation Museum in Ohio? Because he says is if you don't believe the literal account of creation, then you are showing other people that the Bible is not true, because if God didn't create literally on days 1 through 6 and then rested on 7, then how can you trust the rest of the text? The very beginning we don't take serious as a real literal creation.
That's a little bit what Tim...
I'm sorry, I can't...
No, that's okay. That's a little bit what he was getting at, but my answer is different. It's difficult to answer that without sounding like a jerk, so I don't want to sound that way. And the Creation Museum and the guys who are sort of literal creationists, I have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're wonderful and godly and intelligent people. But I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong on almost everything they say, predominantly because of how I understand the Bible. But that doesn't mean that they're bad or that they're stupid or I'm smart somehow or anything like that. It just means we come from very different backgrounds. For example, they make the case that if you don't believe the 6-day literal creation, that you can't really be a Christian. But in no creed of any denomination or any church since Jesus has a literal 6-day belief in creation ever been adopted. Ever. It's not Episcopalian, it's not Catholic, it's not, Baptist. Nobody lists that as one of the big issues. Well, how do we know we're saved? It is salvation by faith through Christ alone. I mean, it's Jesus. So how we interpret Genesis is really a secondary issue to who we're following. And if we're the people of Jesus, little Christs, Christians, imitators of Jesus, there's room for disagreement.